Get started.
Good afternoon, everyone. While we're giving it another minute or so to go ahead and get started, why don't you tell us where you're joining from in the chat? Click the chat feature and tell us where you're joining from. We're so excited to have so many of you all joining us this afternoon for a survivor story. We're excited to collaborate with the Virginia Holocaust Museum. My name is Neil. I am the Associate State Director of AARP Virginia here in Central Virginia. And we are so excited to collaborate with the Virginia Holocaust Museum. We have with us Miss Erica Schwartz, who's going to be sharing a survivor story with us this afternoon. We're so excited about today. Listen, part of healthy aging is making sure that we continue to engage our brain. So with programs like this, getting to learn about new experiences and learn someone else's story, we engage our brain and we make ourselves just a little bit smarter today. We're excited to have Miss Erica Schwartz with us. We're excited about collaborating with the Virginia Holocaust Museum. And without further ado, I'm going to turn our program over to Miss Erica Schwartz in just a minute. Just wanted to remind you all just one housekeeping issue. If you have any questions throughout Mrs. Schwartz's presentation, all you have to do is drop those questions in the chat. We will try to respond to as many questions as possible at the end. So please drop your questions in the chat. We will be monitoring the chat throughout her presentation, and then we'll try to get those questions answered for you at the end. Without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Miss Erica. Miss Erica, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carl. I appreciate it. Well, I have my own housekeeping thing to do. Let me first start my screen share. Okay, hopefully that's working. And I just want to say before I start that as I tell my story, as I get into it, you will find that I go far beyond the Holocaust. I talk a lot about my life after the Holocaust, both as a child growing up with my mother and also as an adult. There may come a moment when you'll wonder, why is she telling us all this? It has nothing to do with her Holocaust story. I assure you there is a point. So I just ask you to bear with me and listen to my whole story. And there will be a point at the end to why I'm telling you all of it. So my story begins in a Nazi ghetto in 1944 Hungary. I was marked for death from the moment of my birth. Today, I'm living the happiest years of my life. The years in between are filled with miracles, people of incredible courage, and a life-changing decision. My name is Erica Schwartz, but I was born Erica Hornstein on April 23rd, 1944, in Nyíregyháza, Hungary, just 2 weeks before all of the women and children in my family were transported to Auschwitz to be murdered. That defines me as a Holocaust survivor, and it's the world I inhabited at the beginning of my life. The other world was as a child of a survivor. My memories are my mother's memories. I was only a year old when the war ended. My father died in a forced labor camp when I was just 11 months old. I never knew him, but when I was just a few days old, he had held me and kissed me. My great-grandmother, grandmother, aunts, and little cousins had all known me. They had held and loved me for the first week of my life. Then, shortly after my birth, most of them were murdered in the gas chambers of Auschwitz. Those were the events that tied me to the world of being a survivor, and that was how I defined myself for the first 44 years of my life. As a child of a survivor, my life revolved around trying to be the caregiver to a mother who had been totally destroyed by the war. She lost her entire family. As far back as I can remember, I knew that I was expected to fill that void for her. I could never do enough or be enough. So in addition to having no extended family, I grew up with the painful message that I was a failure as my mother's child. And that was a tough burden for a little kid who had no one to turn to for a reality check. My mother was born in the town of Hajdúchamszon. Until her mid-teens, she lived in that small town, surrounded by grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. The entire family lived within walking distance of each other. Her parents were Honey Wertheimer, a homemaker, and David Petrover, a watchmaker. She had two sisters, Margit and Olga. She also had two brothers, Avram and Yena. In 1938, when my mother was just 16 years old, the Hungarian government passed laws restricting Jewish participation in ordinary day-to-day life. Jews were forbidden to participate in most professions. Jewish children weren't allowed to attend public schools. Jews were forced to abandon their homes. My mother's family was forced from their home in Heideshamschen and moved to the city of Niederhausen. By the early 1940s, people in the United States were already hearing rumors about the murder of multitudes of Jews in Eastern Europe. My grandfather's sister Rose, who had immigrated to the United States when she was a teenager, began to bombard my grandfather with letters begging him to get the family out of Europe. His response was no. He believed the family was safe and that the war would be over long before the Nazis turned their attention to Hungary. My parents met in July of 1941. It was love at first sight. They were married on August 20th, just a few weeks after they met, and just 1 week before my mother's 20th birthday. They settled in Budapest, where my father was manager of a bridal shop. Life changed drastically when Hungary, allied with Nazi Germany, rounded up all the young Jewish men and imprisoned them in forced labor camps. My father was taken sometime in early 1943. At first, wives were permitted to visit their husbands in the camps, and in the fall of 1943, my mother learned that she was pregnant. She was terrified to be alone, and by then was no longer permitted to visit my father. So she left their Budapest apartment and moved in with her parents in Niederhausen. On March 19, 1944, Nazis occupied the town. By April 17th, during the Passover holiday, they completed the construction of the ghetto. A wall topped with barbed wire encircled the entire Jewish neighborhood. Jews from all the surrounding towns were herded into the ghetto. On April 24th, the ghetto was sealed, and preparations begun to transport all the Jews to Auschwitz. My grandparents' home was within the boundaries of the ghetto, so all of my mother's female relatives and their children, most of whom lived in small nearby villages, were moved into the house. The men had long ago either been taken into forced labor like my father, or had been dragged from their homes, forced to dig their own graves and shot, as was my grandfather. Now living in the home with my grandmother were my mother's sister Margit and her two little boys, Mickey and Imre, my mother's sister-in-law Clara and her little girl, Shushi, my great-grandmother Dina, and my mother's younger sister Olga. I was born on April 23rd, just one day before the Niederhausen ghetto was sealed. But when the transports to Auschwitz began, my mother and I were no longer in the ghetto, and I'll tell you about that in a moment. All of the women and children who remained in my grandparents' home were transported by cattle car to Auschwitz. Jews were loaded shoulder to shoulder into the cattle cars. There was no room to sit. There was no food or water. The trip took days. There were always numerous dead bodies by the time the train arrived. When they reached Auschwitz, my great-grandmother, grandmother, and three little cousins were murdered in the gas chamber. By the end of May, all 17,580 Jews in that ghetto have been transported to Auschwitz. It's been estimated that between 600 and 800 survived the war. When the cattle cars were unloaded, a life or death decision was made immediately by the presiding SS officer. A person's answer to the simple questions, how old, healthy or ill, determined whether you would live or die. The elderly too young to work, or ill were sent immediately to the gas chamber. If you were clutching a child who was too young to work, you were sent to the gas chamber with the child. No questions were asked. No one grabbed a child away from its mother. That would cause panic, and panic was to be avoided at all costs. My mother's older sister, Margie, and her sister-in-law, Clara, were the only ones who survived the initial selections. Like many of the young women who weren't clutching children when they reached the front of the selection line, they were chosen for slave labor in the camp. Although the two young women had arrived with their children, some of the Jewish prisoners who were forced to help unload the cattle cars tried to convince all of the young women to hand their children over to elderly people. They tried to save the lives of these young mothers by calmly telling them that it would be better to let the children go with the elderly. The mothers, of course, didn't know that they were sending their children to their immediate death. Margaret and Clara handed the three children to my grandmother, and I can't imagine what her last moments must have been like in the gas chamber with her three little grandchildren. Clara, my mother's sister-in-law, was the only one who survived the war. She told my mother how her sister Margie died. Margie survived until the very end, working in the kitchens of Auschwitz. On the day of liberation, on the very day that the Allies entered Auschwitz to liberate the prisoners, many of the remaining Nazis were so intent on killing Jews that instead of fleeing from the Allies, they stayed to randomly shoot and kill as many Jews as they could. My Aunt Margie was killed on the day of liberation. Three people were instrumental to the fact that I'm here to tell the story. As I mentioned earlier, my father was imprisoned in a forced labor camp. In spite of widespread rumors about the death camps, most Hungarian Jews could not believe that the rumors were true. However, the men in the labor camps did believe them. My father had also learned the system that the Nazis were using to find the Jews. At that time in Europe, many official documents listed a person's religion. So using these documents and the addresses associated with them, the Nazis demanded that all Jews be imprisoned in a ghetto closest to their official address. My mother had been living in Nyíregyháza, but her official address was still the Budapest apartment in which she and my father had previously lived. And this became the deciding factor that saved our lives. When word reached my father that my mother had given birth and that we were imprisoned in the ghetto, he somehow managed to escape from the labor camp and headed straight to Nyíregyháza. With him, he had official papers with the address of their Budapest apartment. The Jews in Budapest had not yet been rounded up, and he knew that he could buy time if he could get us there. He was right. Almost all of the Hungarian Jews who survived the war were in Budapest. My father arrived at the ghetto when I was just a few days old. He immediately went to the office of the authorities, which in Hungary was the Arrow Cross, a segment of the Hungarian military that was more than happy to help the Nazis. He presented the papers showing that my mother and I should officially be in Budapest. Of course, he was repeatedly turned down, and he camped outside the headquarters for days. When I was a little over a week old, miraculously, he was granted papers to take us to Budapest. He wasted no time preparing to get us out of the ghetto. After he received permission to take us to the city, my mother suddenly insisted on staying with her mother. My father had told her that after getting us to Budapest, he was going back to the labor camp. He knew that he was being hunted, and he was afraid to be with us in case he was discovered with us. So again, terrified of being alone, my mother refused to leave. My grandmother literally pushed her out the door and locked it behind her. My father took us to Budapest and went back to the labor camp, where he died on March 8, 1945, just 2 months before the Allies liberated the camp. My mother's 19-year-old sister, Olga, somehow slipped out of the ghetto when my father got my mother and me out. She also headed straight to Budapest. When they reached the city, my mother and Olga were able to obtain Christian identity papers. And using these papers, they managed to get an apartment and for 2 months lived quietly and safely as two Christian women with a baby. On July 5th, 1944, Olga left the apartment to get food. Just as she stepped out of the building, a former neighbor recognized her and yelled, "She's a Jew." Nearby Arrow Cross soldiers immediately ran in her direction. She turned and ran back into the building with the soldiers close behind her. She must have realized that she had very few options, or none at all, that wouldn't lead the soldiers directly to my mother and me hiding in the apartment. So she made a fateful decision. My teenage aunt raced to the roof of the building and jumped. She died on a Budapest sidewalk on July 5th, 1944, and my mother and I were never discovered. When I was in Budapest with my rabbi several years ago, I learned for the first time that my Aunt Olga was buried in a single grave in the Jewish cemetery just outside of Budapest. I have no idea how that could have happened in the chaos of 1944 Hungary. In 2017, our family had a stone erected on what had been, for 73 years, her anonymous grave. Also in 2017, when I went back to Budapest to see Olga's headstone, I was finally able, after decades of searching, to find the mass grave in which my father is buried. So that's the story of the murder of my mother's entire family. However, that's not the end of my story. Sometime after the war ended, my mother's Aunt Rose discovered that we had survived. We were living in Budapest, and my mother was still clinging to the desperate hope that some in her family had survived. In the chaos of post-war Europe, no one knew who was dead or alive. No one knew what had happened to any of their loved ones. Aunt Rose began the process of getting us to the United States and urged my mother to leave Hungary as soon as possible. She refused. She was sure that any survivors from her family would be looking for her in Budapest, so she just couldn't leave. It took her over 2 years to accept the fact that she and I were the only survivors. She finally agreed to immigrate to the United States. But by that time, everything had changed. Hungary was now a communist country, and it was almost impossible to get out. Aunt Rose arranged for a distant cousin who was a U.S. citizen to fly to Hungary, marry my mother, and take her to the United States. There was just one catch. She couldn't leave with me. She would have to temporarily leave me behind. Aunt Rose assured her that once my mother arrived in the United States, it would be a simple process to get me out of Hungary. Needless to say, it was a very difficult decision, but she finally agreed. So she turned me over to trusted friends and headed to New York with her new husband. I remember being carried in her arms to the train station and standing there as the train pulled away with my mother hanging out the window sobbing. But I also remember that I was too busy picking up pebbles from the ground to wave goodbye, and my mother never let me forget that. She had appointed an old family friend with good connections as my guardian, and that was very fortunate, because immediately after she left Hungary, the trusted couple disappeared with me. They wanted to keep me. I have the telegram that my mother received from my guardian, advising her that the couple had disappeared. He urged her to stay put and promised that he would find me. 6 months later, she received another telegram. I had been found and was on my way to the United States. I remember that trip. Here is a picture of me in Hungary with my guardian. In the center of this slide is a picture of the actual manifest from my Pan Am flight to the United States, with my name, Ornstein Erica, highlighted, and a photo of the Newark Airport arrival area in the late 1940s. I clearly remember stepping off the plane at that airport and seeing my mother hysterically screaming my name from that observation deck. My mother's new marriage was only supposed to facilitate getting us out of Hungary. However, she was alone, afraid, and very beautiful. He wanted to stay married, so she agreed. That was a mistake. He turned out to be very violent, and I remember the day I came home from kindergarten and found her lying beaten on the living room floor. It took her almost 2 years to finally get the courage to leave, and leave we did in a hurried, terrified run while he was at work. So that was the beginning of many heart-thumping, frightening incidents that would define my life for decades. It was also the beginning of my journey through 9 different elementary schools, and that had a huge impact on my life well into my adulthood. I was always the new kid on the block, and I had a very difficult time making friends. We were constantly on the move. When I was 7, she met the man who would become my stepfather, but even that didn't settle us down. From the time they married until 2 years later, when the first of my 2 brothers was born, we had already moved 3 times. A year later, my second brother was born, and we moved 2 more times before we settled in the one place that I would stay until I got married. High school was the only school I ever went to from start to finish. I had a ton of emotional baggage by the time I got into high school. I had developed the habit of lying to try to make myself stand out quickly. I had no idea how long I'd be in any one neighborhood, and I was desperate for friends. Of course, the lies always backfired, but I had not yet learned that lesson. To make matters even worse, the dad that I was so thrilled about when I was 7 turned out to be no dad at all. He never treated me like a daughter, and he and my mother fought all the time. So I acted out in a way that I later learned was typical for a young girl with no father. I was insanely boy crazy. And with a mother who wasn't paying attention, my life was miserable. I was still trying to find ways to shortcut the path to popularity. I hated being home. There was constant yelling and hysteria. My mother was always screaming at either me or my stepfather. Then, shortly after my 16th birthday, I suddenly realized that my knight in shining armor had been present in my life all along. I had known Bill since I was 4. His family lived in the Bronx apartment building that my mother and I lived in when we first came to the United States. Our mothers had been best friends, so we saw each other occasionally over the years. I was just 10 years old when I had my first crush on him, but of course he was just one of many crushes, and he was 4 years older, so he was not interested. But everything changed when I was 16. We hadn't seen each other in a few years. The spark started to fly, and we began dating. But I didn't make it easy on him. We dated on and off because I was still having a lot of crushes. When I was 18, something finally clicked. He proposed, I said yes, and we got engaged. A year later, we married and recently celebrated our 60th wedding anniversary. I guess maybe I've grown up. However, the years of being raised by a very broken mother had a huge effect on my ability to function. Survivors of the Holocaust, those who were old enough to experience the horrors and who knew and loved the family members who were murdered, were traumatized beyond anything that can be imagined. It's difficult to even talk about the atrocities and inhumanity that they witnessed. They were damaged for life. Some were resilient or lucky enough to be able to eventually rise above the trauma and find happiness. Others never recovered. My mother never recovered. She was unable to feel empathy, unable to demonstrate the kind of love that a child needs, and some of us never get. I never heard her say that she was proud of me or that I was a good daughter. I did everything for her until the day she died, but her need was so great that whatever I did was never enough. Not only didn't I have my emotional needs met as a child, I also had no role model to show me what it meant to be a loving wife and mother. It nearly ruined my marriage and had a profound effect on my children. She was also unable to share her children with anyone who wasn't related to her by blood. I often felt that I had to choose between my mother and my husband, or between my mother and my two sons, because both were adopted and not related to her by blood, and even between my mother and my one and only grandchild. So for many years, I behaved exactly like my role model. I needed all the attention from everyone around me. If I didn't get it, I would go into a rage. The same behavior that I had experienced from my mother. After Bill and I married, she was still demanding my full attention, so we fled to Maryland. However, as soon as we bought our first house, she immediately moved just a couple of blocks from us, and this pattern would repeat itself until the day she passed. The last house was right across the street from us. In addition to all the stresses of dealing with a very broken mom, there were many more aspects of my adult life that made me feel as if I was constantly being victimized by fate. And the word victim is an important part of the rest of my story. As I mentioned earlier, our two sons were adopted. Shortly after our first baby, David, was placed with us, Bill became very ill. He had Crohn's disease, and it created havoc in our lives for 10 years. To make matters even worse, David was conceived in San Francisco during the Summer of Love. If you don't know what that means, you can rest assured that it's very highly likely that his birth parents were on drugs when he was conceived. As a result, the price that he has paid for that is to suffer from severe ADHD his entire life. He still struggles with it to this day. Our second baby, Jeremy, was born on the Navajo reservation. We were still living in Maryland at the time, and the red tape took 3 months to navigate before we could bring him home. And for those 3 months, Jeremy was in a foster home where he was severely neglected. As a result of this, he suffered from failure to bond syndrome, and our beautiful little boy was never able to fully connect emotionally with anyone. And there was more chaos in my life. After both of my brothers moved permanently to California, I decided that I didn't want to spend the rest of my life living a continent away from them. Bill and I had begun to have a pretty decent and stable life in Maryland. Chaos was on the back burner for the first time in my life, but it only lasted a few years. Bill had established a successful business. We were relatively happy, and his agreement to walk away from all of that and take the risk was certainly proof of his love for me. So in 1979, we moved from Maryland to California, including my mother, of course. The chaos that had begun to ease in Maryland exploded in California. The relationships between everyone fell apart. Bill couldn't get a business going and fell into a deep depression for years. My mother needed to be the center of attention of all three of her children. So she pitted us against each other, and our sibling relationships deteriorated. Worst of all, both of my sons discovered drugs as soon as we moved to California. The ensuing years were a nightmare. Everything was going wrong. For 44 years, I had seen myself as the victim of circumstances completely beyond my control. Then, on a fateful day in 1988, I heard someone say the most important words that I had ever heard in my entire life. And these were the words: "You may not have control over anything that's happening around you, but you have complete control over what happens between your two ears." That message sunk in immediately. For the first time in my life, I realized that my happiness or lack of happiness just might be a choice. I could find joy in my day, or I could find misery. There was always plenty of that. I could see only the bad, or I could seek what was good. I had a choice. At that very moment, I became determined to learn who I really was. I had lived my life exactly as I had been taught to. How do I find happiness when everything around me is always falling apart? It seemed impossible. but for some miraculous reason, I knew I had to do it. And I found the roadmap. I started writing a gratitude list every day. Before my feet hit the floor in the morning, I grabbed pad and pen and wrote a list of everything I could think of for which I was grateful. You've heard the saying, smell the roses? Well, I literally did. I took long walks, smelled the flowers, listened to the birds, and marveled at the beautiful blue sky. I'm pretty sure I looked goofy to my neighbors, but I could feel that it was working. I knew I had to combat the terrible negative thoughts about the people in my life. Those ugly thoughts were constantly in my head. So I worked at finding the good in the people that I wanted to love. And that became another daily list. I resented my mother. I would write every good thing she had done the previous day. I was angry at my husband, my kids, my siblings. I wrote lists of everything I loved about them. And slowly, I realized it was working. I had been programmed by nurture to see only what was bad in my life. But to my astonishment, I realized that I did have the ability to see what was good. I simply had to learn how to tap into it. It wasn't easy. I had spent 44 years mirroring my mother's perception of life, and it took several years for me to overwrite the program in my head. I clearly remember the day that I realized I was no longer working at it. What I desperately wanted was coming naturally. Today, I cherish all that I have rather than focus on what I don't have. I count my blessings every day. Most importantly, I've learned to let go of people over whom I have no control. Also in 1988, obviously the most important year of my life, my one and only grandchild, Kim, was born. She's Jeremy's daughter, and the odds were slim that she would be in our lives. Jeremy was 17 and deeply into drugs and alcohol when Kim was born. Her mother could have easily shut us out of their lives, but she didn't. She encouraged the incredible relationship we have with Kim. So both Kim and her mom are at the top of my gratitude list every day. When Kim married her wonderful husband and they had 3 children, my amazing great grandsons, my heart burst with joy and I couldn't imagine ever having another sad day. But several years ago, they moved from California, where we all lived, to Missouri. They had been the center of our lives, and one more time, my world literally fell apart. But in 2019, Bill and I moved to Missouri because Kim and her husband convinced us that they wanted us to live near them. And so began the best years of my life. But that doesn't mean that everything's been perfect. Our precious son, Jeremy, Kim's father, was a lifelong alcoholic, and we recently lost him to liver failure. What got me through that awful time was reminding myself that my greatest joy comes from his daughter and her family. And that's how I practice counting my blessings every day. As I said at the very beginning, I'm living the happiest years of my life. So one last reminder, you may not have control over anything that's happening around you, but you have complete control over everything that happens between your 2 ears. And that is the end of my story, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Wow. Well, thank you, Erica, first and foremost for sharing your story. We've got several comments in the chat talking about how amazing your story is and appreciating you for simply sharing and being so transparent with us this afternoon. The first question that we see in the chat is someone asking, how did these photos survive? You shared a lot of pictures with us. They want to know how did you get these photos?
That is one of the miracles in our lives. Um, when my parents got married, one of the gifts that my father gave my mother was a photo album. And she immediately filled it with pictures of her family. And when the war got to the point where she had to be on the move and basically was homeless, all she had with her was me in a carriage and that photo album under the mattress. And that was all she had at the end of the war. That's where those pictures came from. And I remember for many years before scanners were invented, that my brothers and I used to fight about who was going to get that album. When mom was finally willing to part with it. But now, thanks to technology, we all have the pictures.
Wow. Thank you for that. Um, the next question is, what led you to adoption?
I was unable to have children.
Okay,
So, and I definitely wanted to be a mom.
gotcha,
We hit the jackpot with both of our sons.
gotcha. Okay. Um, the next question is, did a therapist help you at all with your journey?
I would have to say no, not really. I did try many different types of therapy and different therapists over the years before I finally kind of went off on my own journey of self-discovery, as I put it. I even remember one of my therapists was a Hungarian Holocaust survivor who was a psychologist, and I went to her for many years. Nothing really seemed to make a dent until I heard those magical words back in 1988 and started just working on myself.
Got it. Um, someone asked, how did you find the mass grave where your father was buried?
Well, I've been doing a lot of research about my family and about things that happened in Hungary. And I even have books that were written about the Holocaust in Hungary, and even in particular in Nyíregyháza, where I was born. And I remember many years ago, I uncovered a newspaper article that talked about how the men that had died in this particular uh, labor camp had been moved to a mass grave in a Jewish cemetery outside of Budapest. I knew the name of the labor camp that my father had been in because the Red Cross was providing a lot of information for many years after the war, and that was one of the pieces of information I got from the Red Cross. So it was that old newspaper article from I think 1947 that talked about the mass grave. Um, but I had no idea what cemetery or where it was until actually very recently, only maybe about 6 or 7 years ago, I was able to find it.
Thank you for that. Um, someone asked a question, or really, I'll ask it's two separate questions. They asked, do you share your story often, and have you shared your story with the Shoah Foundation?
Well, let me answer the second one first. I did not, because when the Shoah Foundation was doing their interviews, my mother was interviewed. As a matter of fact, she was interviewed twice, and there was one time that I was with her, and they gave me like a couple of minutes segment. But I never, there is no individual testimony from me with the Shoah Foundation. Yes, I share my story very, very often. I started maybe about 8 or 9 years ago. Um, on the average, it used to be once or twice a month, which was bearable because it's difficult. It just puts me right back in that headspace every time I do it. Um, but these past few months, I would have to say, particularly since October 7th, it's been, I can't even describe it. It's been a marathon. And the last couple of months were incredibly draining because it was many times a week, in some cases, many times in a matter of just a couple of days. And so right now things are quieting down and my brain is starting to get back to normal.
All right. Someone asked the question, what would you say to Holocaust deniers?
I'm asked that often, and my answer is I have nothing that I would say to a Holocaust denier because I personally believe that there is so much evidence. I mean, there's a documentary that was made by General Eisenhower when he entered with American troops into a concentration camp, into a death camp. And he ordered them to film everything they saw because he clearly said in the documentary that there will come a time when people will say this didn't happen. So there is so much evidence that my personal belief is that when someone says the Holocaust didn't happen, they know they're lying. They know it did. They're just saying it for whatever evil reason they have, but they know. So you can't have a debate with someone who knows that they're lying.
Gotcha. The next question is, how was your father able to escape the camp?
I do not know. And I'm asked that a lot too. A lot of the information I got about those years from my mother just came from her responding to questions that I asked her, which I didn't really start doing until I was an adult. She never volunteered any information, but she always answered any questions that I had. And of course, now that I've started telling the story and getting all these questions from people, I can think of thousands of questions I wish I would have asked her, but that's not one I ever asked, so I don't know.
Um, and I mean, you're getting a lot of folks in the comments just saying how excellent this was, how excellent your story is, how brave you are, people celebrating your bravery. I think the final question that I see is, have you ever considered writing a book?
That's a timely question because yes, I did, and no, I'm not. I actually got about halfway through a manuscript, and it was just maybe 3 days ago that I announced that I was not going to complete it. Um, as I alluded to in my talk, in order to get to the point, what I think is an important point at the end of my story about that there is hope no matter what you're going through, there is hope to change your own perspective of life. In order for me to get to that, I would have to go into a lot of detail about what it was like, mostly being my mother's daughter. I don't have a long Holocaust story. I only have what I told you. I have nothing more because I don't have experiences. So most of my story really is about what it was like being raised by a very broken Holocaust survivor. And then, of course, the other things that, that occurred that made my life miserable for over 4 decades. And after starting to write that story, I realized I couldn't do it. I couldn't put into writing all of my experiences with my mother because she was destroyed by the war. She was not an evil person. It was just, she was not the kind of mother a child needs. And that led to a lot of trauma in my life. But I couldn't put it into writing. I could not sell that as a book.
Right. Thank you for sharing that. I do see that another question popped up in the chat. Someone asked, "Have you ever visited any of the camps where your family was?"
I've been to Auschwitz 3 times. The first time, needless to say, was horrendous. Just walking through that gate was very, very difficult, knowing that my grandmother, my great grandmother, the 3 little baby cousins just were murdered there. So that was really hard. And that was on a trip with my rabbi many years ago, where he took several members of the congregation uh, to various Eastern European countries. The other 2 times I went as a participant in the March of the Living, which is a worldwide program that takes high school seniors and Holocaust survivors to Poland to visit the camps and mass graves. So yeah, I've been to Auschwitz 3 times.
Okay. Looks like one final question or an additional question that someone asked is there an update on your older son, your oldest son?
He's fine. He's living in California. We speak to him often. As I said, he's still struggling. He's got severe ADHD. He's 56 years old. He's always been, self-sufficient. He, but he's, it's difficult. He's paying a price for what his biological parents were doing when he was conceived. And that's a warning to any young people that think it's okay to have drugs and get pregnant. It's not.
Thank you for sharing that with us. Um, again, Erica, thank you for sharing your story with us. Before we wrap things up today, is there anything else that you want to share in closing with us today? I know you said a lot, but is there anything that you want to share in closing today?
Well, usually when I'm asked that, I say no. But right now, nobody asked me the one question that I'm asked a lot. So I'm going to just kind of throw it in there. Um, people are comparing or asking about current events, particularly, um, all the anti-Semitism, anti-Israel, all that that's going on right now. And I would urge people to really look at how the Holocaust started. Everybody knows what the Holocaust did and what happened during it, but very few have really studied how it started. It wasn't an overnight thing. It was a slow process that started with university students, with rallies in German universities, with people, chanting anti-Semitic things, and I think people need to really look at that, especially now, and study how the Holocaust started, how things like that begin. Not only, not only for the sake of the Jews, but for the sake of anybody, any group of people that is targeted with propaganda.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that reminder, Erica, and thank you for sharing that with us. To all of you who joined us this afternoon, we apologize if we didn't get to your question in the chat, or if we missed it. But we do thank Miss Erica. Please join me in thanking her in the comments. You guys have been celebrating her bravery and sharing her story all afternoon. But please continue to let her see your support in the chat. We thank all of you all for joining us this afternoon. Again, part of healthy aging is continuing to engage your brain in learning new stories, learning new pieces of history, and hearing stories like this is a way that we continue to engage our brains. In a few days, you will get a survey that just discusses your experience here with us this afternoon. Please take a moment and just complete that survey for us. You will also get a recording of this. And we thank all of you all for joining us. You can continue to visit our website if you want more programs like this, a listing of things that are happening in the state of Virginia and all over. We are excited about what AARP Virginia is doing, and we celebrate Erica today for sharing your story. And thank you to the Virginia Holocaust Museum for collaborating with us on this afternoon. To all of you who joined us, we hope that you have a wonderful rest of your evening. Thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of your day. Goodbye, everyone.